Hi, Grover Norquist here. We're at Americans for Tax Reform, and we have with us Major Garrett, whose new book, Mr. Trump's Wild Ride, which is all up behind me as well, tells the story of the first year of the Trump administration before everything calmed down. And Major Garrett is now CBS News Chief White House Correspondent since 2012. He was with a number of presidential campaigns. He's been with Chief White House Correspondent for Fox as well, the White House Correspondent for CNN, Senior Editor and Congressional Correspondent for U.S. News and World Report, Washington Times, and with the Houston Post, the Las Vegas Journal, and the Amarillo Globe News. So a long history in print and television media, and has really focused on presidential races and the White House over the last several years. And if I could just say, has written an extremely helpful, useful book. This is about all the interesting things backstage and the product of those things. So it's not just how people are talking to each other in the White House, but what's actually being accomplished in terms of legislation, regulatory changes, the existence or absence of wars. And it, I think, is much more useful than straight policy shops, which just talk about the policy, but not how you made the, what's the word I'm looking for? Sausage. How you make the sausage. Or the people who only talk about how unpleasant it can be when the chefs are throwing things at each other in the kitchen and not paying attention to what the end result is. So doing both, Major Garrett is joining us here. We'll talk for 15 minutes or so and then take some questions. And this is going live, so no naughty words.
There you go. Great to have you all here. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm very proud of the book. The question a lot of people ask now is, do we really need another Trump book? I mean, honestly, aren't there enough? And I would say there are enough of a certain kind. There's just not enough of these. It's about what happened, not what didn't happen. And why do I think what happened is important? Well, that's what I cover day to day. But it's also whether you love the Trump administration or despise the Trump administration, and millions of Americans put themselves every day in both camps, things are happening. And the sense that the White House is run differently and there is an improvisational, sometimes volcanic approach that President Trump takes to his leadership model is a fact, and it's established fact. But that doesn't mean that which he presides over is inert or inactive. It's not. There are some times when things don't happen, but there have been considerable examples of things that have happened and already form, for better or for worse, I'll let the historians debate this as they inevitably will, part of the Trump legacy. Let's just talk about 4 topics. There are many more in the book, but let's just talk about 4. Grover mentioned taxes. The tax reform and tax cut bill will be with the country for 5 to 10, maybe 20 years. The politics around that have shifted in such a way that even though there is aggressive Democratic criticism of them, I don't believe if there is a majority in the Democratic House and Senate or a Democratic president, you are going to dismantle a lot of this. You may dismantle some of it or parts of it, but not most of it. So even if there's a big political shift and a reassessment, I think 70 to 80% of what's in that bill stays. That's a significant change in the way the federal government collects revenue. Small businesses plan to pay their taxes. Corporations plan to pay their taxes. Repatriation of billions of dollars that were held offshore, now flowing back in. All positive? I don't know. I'm not a tax expert. I just know it's a big shift. I have an entire chapter on deregulation, not exactly the sexiest subject to write in a book. Deregulation is really hard to write about. It is in some ways amorphous. It's hard to know what changes will matter, what changes will enhance a small business or corporate environment, what may expose the country to unexpected risks. I don't know. I can't answer that. What I can tell you is, by number, and I go through them in great detail, this is the most aggressive deregulatory president in approach since Ronald Reagan, and far more aggressive in terms of actually taking regulations off the book than Reagan was ever in 8 years. And one of the reasons that's true is because President Reagan had a nominally conservative Republican Senate and a Democratic House. When I say nominally conservative Republican Senate, I go back and list many of the members of the Republican Senate Conference back in the early years of the Reagan administration who were then thought of as moderate Republicans, would today be thought of as either extremely moderate Republicans or left-wing Republicans, if such a thing existed. And they were not on board with this deregulatory agenda of Reagan's and were skeptical and did what they could to resist it. Not true of this Congress. I quote Grover in the book saying that Congress is a reflection of Reagan philosophy, Reagan approach to politics in the House and Senate. So you have a president who's on a deregulatory agenda and a sympathetic, willing, and compliant Congress. Through the Congressional Review Act, a lot of things were done to essentially wipe away regulations promulgated by President Obama in the last year of his presidency, almost a regulatory erasure of the last year of the previous presidency. That's not insignificant. I talk about the federal bench, not just Neil Gorsuch. Don't know what's going to happen with Brett Kavanaugh, but that's the second nominee. There's a vacancy, it's going to be filled. That's two. The time horizon appears to be somewhat in question right now, but that's going to be two, one way or another. Not only that, more than a dozen appellate court justices nominated and confirmed, 12 in the first year, higher than any president in American history. That also constitutes a change, and a very certain kind of change, because these are not justices and nominees picked out of a hat. They're not lottery ticket winners. They are of a certain approach. And I mentioned in the book that there are things that Donald Trump doesn't know. And when he doesn't know, he subcontracts people who do. And in this case, he subcontracted the Federalist Society. You guys know. You guys have the roster, and you have the political backing, and you have the initiative. Give me names. That's how the list was formed about potential Supreme Court nominees if he wins. That's how the list was refined right before the general election. That's how the list has informed the two choices made so far for the Supreme Court. Again, significant changes. I don't put my thumb on the scale one way or the other about whether this is great or whether this is horrific. There's plenty of Americans who debate that all the time. What I tried to do is take my nose away from the glass, which I'm pressed up against hour by hour, day by day at the White House, and for my own benefit, say, what's the measure? What measure can we take of this so far? A lot of it is right here. One last issue, immigration. Again, this is, are you comfortable or uncomfortable with this issue and the president's approach? One of the things I say in the book is, the president hasn't changed the law. The president is only enforcing the law to its maximum definitional limits. Hasn't changed any laws. No new immigration laws have been passed or signed. But what is on the books and how it can be interpreted, aggressively enforced. There's lots of court challenges to that, but it is the approach, and it is reflective in some ways of an undercurrent of politics that many people in Washington, including many in this room, thought were settled. Donald Trump explained to the country that that wasn't a settled issue. I'm not asking you to be in favor of that. I'm not asking you to oppose that. I'm just saying you have to stand back and acknowledge that there was something out there that, whether it was cynical or just intuitive, he spoke to and became a constant thematic part of the support that Donald Trump registered routinely in the primaries, carried through the nominating convention, and carried through the general election. And if you are someone who appreciates questions asked and answers given in the context of a presidential campaign, it has to matter. Whether you like the question asked or the answer you got back is a secondary issue. You just have to say, this candidate asked the question differently than it had been asked in almost 30 years. The last time it was asked in that sort of way was in California with Proposition 187, and he wasn't even as harshly asked then. People tend to forget that 187 passed with nearly 60% of the vote in California. Stymied in the courts, true enough. California's moved on, but as I point out in the book, some of that politics had not been moved on from. It still existed in a great swath of the country. And for better or for worse, the president, as a candidate and now as president, has tapped into that. And in so doing, enforcing immigration laws in ways that are unrecognizable to many Americans, a topic of controversy and a topic around the world, because the world thought we had settled on this issue. Quite obviously we haven't. That is a change. Again, no thumb on the scale. I'm not arguing it's for good or for ill. I'm just saying it's a massive change in orientation to the way existing laws are enforced and our own sense of ourselves and our sense of national conversation and the way the world community looks at the conversation in America about immigration. Those are four. I think there's a very important chapter in the book about Saudi Arabia and the president's first trip and how his approach to the Middle East is not only different from President Obama's. Of course, that's obviously true. It's also very different from George W. Bush. It doesn't have any of this pie-in-the-sky sense of the majesty or magic of democracy. The president's very clear. His speech in Saudi Arabia at that first summit about counterterrorism was, do what you want. You're in charge of your countries. I'm not going to babysit you and I'm not going to meddle. Just be in common cause with us on the financing and the recruitment and you're fine. And we'll leave you alone. And that, if that means you're authoritarians, that means you do other things that are adventurous and complicate lives in another world, that's fine. I'm not going to worry about that. That's a dramatically different orientation in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia up against Iran. It's a huge shift. I think that's important. I don't tell you what's going to happen from that or what's going to come from that. I don't know. But I do know it's different. And there's the chapter on North Korea. I was on MSNBC earlier in the week and I said, look, there used to be a thought experiment that Republican pollsters tended to do near the end of the Obama administration. And the thought experiment went like this. They would list things that had happened, indices about the economy and other things, some rhetoric from the president, take his name out of it, and just lay it as sort of a fact and some rhetoric before Republicans and say, what do you think? Some Republicans say, well, you know, that's not bad. I could live with that, and some of this rhetoric I'm kind of comfortable with. And then, well, it's President Obama. Well, all right, then the conversation shifts dramatically. Let's do the same thought experiment with North Korea. Take Trump's name out of it. Objectively, wouldn't you say, well, certainly things shifted a little bit. There's now a direct dialogue between North and South that seems to be leading in a different direction, more positive direction. There has been at least statements from North Korea about its intentions. There has been a cessation of activity. Is that because they're all good and they're all technologically up to speed and they don't think they need to test anything more? Possibly. But if you look at the arc of the last year and a half on that issue, it got very scary, very intense, very unpredictable, and then it got to a different place. Lots of change. Some of it appears to be comfortable not only for the North Koreans but the South Koreans in ways that it hadn't been for a long, long time, if ever. Is Trump the only reason for that? No. But he's not irrelevant to those changes. He's not irrelevant to that conversation. It also struck me as that's something we should take stock of, and at least just ask ourselves that he asks different questions. And the questions sometimes rattle those who have been asking and answering questions on a certain topic for a long time. Doesn't necessarily make them the wrong questions or the wrong approach. They may be. But the one thing I've picked up about Trump is he is perfectly willing to ask what sounds to other people like crazy questions. Either to just jar different thoughts loose, to have his own thought experiments, to spitball. But you have to ask yourself, and I think I saw an interview where Bob Woodward was asked about his book about all these crazy ideas and things that were put in motion. Did any of them come to pass? Well, no, they didn't. Okay. I think that's a slightly interesting story. I'm far more interested in things that did happen and why they happened. One last point I'll make is there's an interesting comparison between the president's approach on repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, and the lessons learned from that translating to the president's efforts on tax reform. There are lots of explanations for that, but there are a different set of approaches. And there is a bit of a learning curve that you can measure through the book about his approach. That also seemed to me worth memorializing, because the question is he learning? Can he learn? What's this job doing to him? What's he doing to the job? I don't have all the answers. But on two big topics and two huge initiatives in that first year, there's a definite difference between the way Donald Trump approached one that didn't work and approached the other which did. I thought that was also worth highlighting. So there you go.
Okay, well, take some questions. I yesterday had the opportunity to hear Bob Woodward explain his book, which is all about It's a Mess in the Kitchen and crickets on anything else. And I thought I failed to ask the question, are you the guy who wrote the book 2 years into the Bush 43 administration about how everything was so swimmingly organized as they invaded Iraq and prepared to make Iran the dominant power in the region? Everybody sent the memos to everybody else, and everyone was chatting very well, and they did something 2 years into Lyndon Baines Johnson's presidency, Gulf of Tonkin resolution, 2 years into the Bush presidency, a war in Iraq, which created Iran as a major power. There's also the dog that doesn't bark. Since everybody's quite sure he's going to start a war and have a recession. I don't quite give people credit for that,
right.
But one ought to note that other presidencies with very nice memo flows crashed and burned.
Right, and to the point about Trump has got this potentially dangerous psychological makeup. I mean, there was an entire book published in October of last year, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. I refer to that book. But I also make mention of just two examples. I'm sure I could have found others, but look, I was doing my day job while I was writing the book, not something I recommend. And I quote Douglas MacArthur about Harry Truman's volcanic temper and his blind rages, and how that undermined a significant war effort in the Pacific. That's a supreme commander talking about the commander-in-chief. Yes, there were lots of disagreements and underlying ego clashes there, but this is someone saying the president has a blind rage that inhibits his ability to make rational decisions. I also quote a magazine article written by Time very early in the Clinton presidency, under the headline on the cover, The Incredible Shrinking Presidency, talking about how disorganized, chaotic, ineffective, meandering the Clinton presidency was. Okay. So this Trump effect feels completely different, and in some respects it is, but it's not so different that we have no historical comparisons whatsoever. And one other thing, because people ask me, is, do we have any examples? All you people say it's chaotic and disorganized. Do we have any examples of that? Well, let me just suggest one that goes to 2 points. One that I'm making and one that Grover just made, which is, look at the travel ban. The travel ban and its entire process played out over an entire year in Technicolor. It's a living, breathing example of an initiative that was poorly executed at first. They couldn't explain it themselves. They didn't even know what they meant by the words that they used because they were so disorganized in putting those words together. There were court challenges. They re-examined their language. They rewrote their intentions. They still couldn't explain them, but they were closer. Then by the time they got to a memorandum late in the year, they had learned themselves actually what they wanted to accomplish, how they wanted to accomplish, and most importantly, how they could legally establish the means by which to accomplish the thing they set out to do. This is in full view of everyone, courts, country, the world. A disorganized, chaotic, inefficient, or ineffective rather, not inefficient process that had a big goal and a big aim and a big idea, according to the president. And it circulated through the process and landed, ultimately, in its third iteration, in a place where the Supreme Court, not once but twice, said, that works. This goes to screaming at each other in the kitchen, dropping plates, making a bad appetizer, a marginal entree, and an unbelievable dessert, and getting your payment at the end. That's a real example. You don't need to hypothesize. Do we really know? Is this true? Or did it happen? That's a living, breathing example of a big thing that they attempted to do, confronting lots of different equities, laws, procedures, processes, and, as was described by many at the time, a training wheels moment for an administration and a president.
We have a question from Saul Adusis with 70 Plus.
Major, what in observing the first year, what was the biggest surprise or the most unexpected thing that happened about the president that, going in, you didn't think about him or how he acted or what his responses were to different issues? I mean, what surprised you most or made a lasting impression that you weren't ready for or expecting going in?
I will tell you, I wasn't exactly sure what to expect with the Trump presidency and its orientation to Congress. I wasn't. I read the speeches. I covered many of the speeches. I didn't know that the policy shop at the White House would essentially start with the same question. What did he say in his speech? Not what's our policy development process. What did he say in his speech? And there is something kind of authentic and very straightforward about that. Other campaigns I've covered have massive policy shops, all these white papers, 20 pages on this, 30 pages on that. There was never any of that in the Trump campaign whatsoever. And when the Domestic Policy Council, although whatever its resulting bureaucracy within the Trump White House, very small, would set about policy, it was like, what did he say? That's where we'll start. And then we'll frame it out from there. But what did he say? Not what are we thinking, what is our agenda, or what are the various agencies want to do. What did he say, and what are we going to do to try to make what he said real? But in the surprising category, I mentioned this in the book, I would have to say, and it still is, that his first trip as president was to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Come on. Who thought that was Donald Trump's first trip as the elected American president? Not to London, not somewhere in Canada, not to Mexico, not to France, Berlin, long-standing allies, or even geopolitical. Go to China, it's a big deal, huge issues. No, Riyadh. And make that summit something that may be a significant event in that regional history and in the conversation about not only recruitment but financing of terrorism. I don't know if it will be, but I know things were said there that had never been said before, not just by an American president, but by the leader of that kingdom, King Salman. Go back and look at his speech. Now, speeches come and go. Speeches from kings can come and go. But that was not a one-off, it doesn't seem to me. And if someone had asked me during the campaign, especially after the Muslim ban speech in South Carolina, all right, name the 20th place that Donald Trump would go to as president. Saudi Arabia still wouldn't have been on that list. And that he went there first and basically staked this claim of his presidency and his orientation to that region in that way. And therefore created this not only alliance with, but deference to, not just King Salman, but Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, the heir apparent. That's a big deal. And that was probably in miniature and for all the time since, though largely forgotten, the biggest surprise for me.
Well, wait, yeah. Oh, question here.
Hi, John Carch with Americans for Tax Reform. Major, congratulations on the book. I love it. Page 41, you discuss the president's decision-making process and the people that he listens to. And you quote Reince Priebus, you interview, said he takes advice from all sources. Can you get into the details of that?
Yeah, I mentioned that the president loves to use the telephone. And in this way, I compare him to Lyndon Baines Johnson, who also used the telephone a great deal. And quite happily, we historians and journalists have lots of recordings of that, and they're deeply revealing about Lyndon Johnson's approach to his job, both politically and as a matter of policy and as a matter of power. Trump uses the phone all the time, much to the distraction of his staff. It was a distraction to Reince Priebus. It was a distraction to many in the inner circle because they didn't know who he was talking to, what he was saying, and how that might be changing his point of view. The president doesn't care. He likes to absorb and take in information independently of a process, independently of papers crossing his desk or people walking in and out of his office. He likes to command at least some sense of his own information gathering, and in the process has met a lot of members of Congress, senators, others. He often has lots of meetings at the White House that are face-to-face, but he relentlessly uses the telephone. And he doesn't just call people you might expect that he would call, business friends, golf partners. He will make phone calls to people he met 30 years ago who happened to be on a work site, or who were a bellman, or who were a cop, or somebody who said something a long time ago to him that he thought in the moment was somewhat wise or commonsensical. Check-in calls. How am I doing? That's almost always part of the conversation. How am I doing? But also, what do you think? What are you hearing? This became a process of adaptation within the White House because people who wanted initiatives put before the president over time figured out that the paperwork wasn't getting it done, the personal meeting wasn't getting it done, but a phone call might. So they'd actually call people that they knew at some level the president might call and would seed the cloud a little bit with an idea or initiative, and sometimes it worked. Sometimes the president would catch on to that. But I do think, because I've encountered him and been encountered by him many times, he's a cagey person, and he's always measuring the moment, the room, and his own sense of authority and power in any interaction. He does that on the phone as much as he does it in person. So the phone is a big part of his life, and as Reince Priebus said to me, most chiefs of staff on any given day for a president would have 10 or 20 inputs. With Trump before noon, there's 50. 50 things he's either seen or heard or read about, but mostly heard or watched, that he wants an answer about, and he wants his answers immediately. He doesn't want his answers tomorrow. He's not interested in a process. He's not interested in the equities of the various agencies. He wants answers immediately. That pressurizes the White House, frustrates him to a fairly well, and is part of the improvisational, sometimes volcanic nature of his approach to leadership.
Wait, question here? Sir? Paul Bedard.
Paul Bedard with the
Got a mic coming, sorry. Oh, then you.
Who I've been happy to know since 1990 when I first came to Washington.
At the Washington Times. Congratulations on finally making it big. Tell me, what is the influence of the two kids, Jared and Ivanka?
Well, Ivanka's quieter, more persistent. Her stock rises and falls in the estimation of those around the president, not the president's. I didn't have a chance to talk to Ivanka for the book, and we should know the White House did not participate in any way, shape, or form in this book. Lots of people are quoted. Everyone's quoted, as a matter of fact. This book's all on the record, except for one blind quote in 320 pages. That's another distinguishing factor of the book. Everyone's on the record. And the book's been out for a week and a half. The White House has had it for 2 weeks, not a peep.
What's a blind quote?
Someone has, I quote someone who works with the White House and works with the congressional Republican leadership. And the quote is, the way these people work around Trump, you would think they're running a government behind his back. That person did not want to be named. That's the one exception in 320 pages. Everyone else is on the record. So, everyone else is quoted accurately, obviously, or I would have heard about it by now. And I had a long interview with Jared Kushner about two things. The Saudi summit, and there are things in the Saudi Arabia chapter that he has never said before about how it came together, how frequently he was on the phone with MBS, and what the kingdom promised, and how he got a lot of pushback from state and the National Security Council. Why are you even doing this summit? They'll never come through. It's going to embarrass the president. Why are you setting him up? Why are you so naive, etc., etc.? And that's not exactly what happened. But Jared Kushner's quoted at length talking about that process in ways he's never been quoted before. And he also explains how his relationship with the Chinese was in part defined by the president's willingness during the transition to take the call from the Taiwanese president. Chinese were very concerned about that, to put it mildly, and we're on the phone with Jared all the time about, why are you doing this? Don't you know? Don't you understand? And of course, there's this interesting aspect of the Trump presidency where I think he understands more than he lets on. And he lets on that he doesn't know, and he's not really sure, and he's sort of stumbling through things, but he may have a better idea and a bigger goal in mind. And I think with the Chinese and the Taiwanese call, there was a bigger goal in mind, which was to at least create a different dynamic where the Chinese were worried about a problem, a call, that really wasn't a problem. It's solvable. You take the call, and they're concerned, and you say, well, what can we do? And Jared says, well, why don't we talk about this face to face in Mar-a-Lago? why doesn't President Xi come to talk to the president? And they can maybe sort some of these things. He said, well, we won't do that unless you reaffirm the one China policy. Jared says, well, that's not hard. We've never walked away from it. We just took a phone call. Because we took a phone call, you thought we were walking away from it. We're not actually walking away from it, but we'll take the summit in Mar-a-Lago, and that was the trade. Now, is that the biggest transaction in world diplomatic history? No, it's not nothing. Because the orientation of all these issues was Trump needs a personal relationship, even with President Xi, maybe especially with him. Because he doesn't want the 7 or 8 layers that typically accompany any negotiation with the Chinese on any subject. He at least wants ability to establish something with Xi if he could. That's what happened at Mar-a-Lago. They spent 4 hours by themselves with only translators. Also highly unusual for any summit with the Chinese, where there's always layers of interlocutors, so everyone hears the same thing and has the same notes and conspicuously records it. That didn't happen. Has everything worked out with China? Obviously not, but that relationship is endlessly fascinating. And I think one of the reasons it is because of this personal attachment established very early on, and the pathway to that, according to Jared, quoted on the record, was taking a phone call from the Taiwanese president.
Question over here.
Yes, congratulations, Major,
Thank you.
for the book. My name is Ildiko Pola and I'm coming from Brussels. I am head of a big Hungarian foundation in Brussels. Brussels basically completely confused about President Trump. I'm one of those persons who want to try to understand him. And I have a basic question. What is going on between Madame Merkel and President Trump?
That's a good question. I think the president, and this is based on everything he said publicly, is always looking for pressure points with Germany and Merkel. Pressure points to intensify the sense that I need your attention and I need to get you to pay attention to things I'm interested in. And if that means, in a dime store psychobabble way, pushing your buttons, I'm going to do that. There's something very odd / interesting / important about Trump's orientation to friends. He's much more willing to push his friends' buttons than he's willing to push his enemies' buttons. The exception is North Korea. Now North Korea, the buttons were pushed relentlessly, and now it's on the other side of the continuum, which also leaves everyone kind of confused. Well, which is it? Is he Rocket Man? Are you going to destroy him? Or is he one of the best, most honorable people on the planet? It's been both within the span of 6 months. Merkel never gets the high side of that, only occasionally. And you see their body languages in the press conferences. Merkel's always just sort of like looking at him like, really? Seriously? This is what I'm dealing with? Yes, it is what you're dealing with. And like so many other people who deal with the president, she wants to say, and she has said, you know, there isn't this big account where NATO money pours in. You know there's no account. You keep talking about the account where the money keeps pouring in. It's just defense budgets in sovereign countries, and they're doing their own thing, and they have their own political limitations. Trump says, yeah, I know that, but I don't care. I'm going to describe it as a big account, and more money's in now, and that's because of me. That's what's important to me. I'm driving the money. And I can't get it across as simply as I want to by saying that sovereign nations and defense budgets and political equities, forget all that. There's a big account and more money's coming in and I'm the reason. Live with that. Live with that reality and understand I'm pushing back because there is this underlying belief, and it's Trump's belief. I'm not validating it, but I'm saying because he's the president and he believes it, it matters, that in the post-World War II era, America was this beneficent trading and aid machine. And its beneficence was altruistic. It achieved a peace. It allowed a rebuilding and an orientation, a strong orientation to the West and the United States, which was all good, but has long since outlived its economic or geopolitical usefulness. Again, I'm not saying that's true or untrue, but he believes it. And that's why he pushes his friends in Europe to understand that their political doctrines or approaches, whether to their own budgeting or their own sense of social infrastructure, is in part fed by this beneficence from the United States, and it's not going to continue. So I can't change your political structure and how generous you are with your work hours and benefits and retirement and pensions and all that, but what I can tell you is that which helped fuel it, American beneficence, is on the wane. And you better wrap your head around that. And the sooner you wrap your head around that, the more our conversations can be different/productive. We're in the middle of that process right now. But this pushing the buttons of friends is an odd part of his approach to projecting his agenda, and everyone in Europe, I think, still is adjusting to it and trying to comprehend it.
Major, before we take this question, could you explain this quotation behind you?
Yes. So that's the first thing that Donald Trump ever said to me. That's early August 2015, location Birch Run, Michigan. It was after the Cleveland debate, the first Republican debate. By then, we at CBS said, you know, this is not a marketing maneuver of Trump's. This isn't just to boost the name and then walk quietly off stage. This is something that is becoming an ever more compelling political story. So I flew out there. Trump had a press conference before his rally. It wasn't even a Trump rally, by the way. It was a local party fundraiser for 2 county Republican parties in Michigan. I still have my press badge. It doesn't say Trump anywhere on it at all. It just says the name of the 2 county Republican counties that were holding this fundraiser. $25 to get in, $75 to be in the front row or near the front row. Anyway, Trump had a press conference before the rally. He takes a couple of questions on the right side. There's about 40 reporters. I'm way over on the left. He sees me. First word, Major. Fantastic, meaning you're here, which means I'm a big deal because you're a network television correspondent and I haven't seen anyone like you at my press conferences. So,
As opposed to those guys?
as opposed to the other guys, printies and other people from local press. Major, fantastic. I'm important because you're here. I watched you with President Obama 2 weeks ago. He was not thrilled. I'm sure I'll be more than thrilled. This is all how I open the book in the prologue, because I say, and I take myself to task, that if I had thought more seriously just about those 3 sentences, I would have learned 70% of the things I needed to learn about Donald Trump as a communicator and as a thinker. Major, fantastic. What does that tell me? It's about him. You're here. I'm important. His sense of adjectival exuberance. Fantastic, great, everything is wonderful. I watched you with President Obama 2 weeks ago. It was actually 4 weeks ago, which means Donald Trump has no sense of time. He literally has no sense of time. He has a sense of memory, a deep sense of memory, and that fixed memory is what matters to him. Time means nothing. And 2 weeks, 4 weeks, it's all interchangeable. Lots of other facts about policy or numbers or debt or deficit also doesn't matter. The big concept. He was not thrilled. That's a reference to a very tough question I put to President Obama. Some of you may remember it, about the Iran nuclear deal and the 4 Americans who were still in captivity in Iran and why they weren't part of the negotiations. He wasn't thrilled. I'm sure I'll be more thrilled. What did that tell me? What it should have told me? Trump always looks at a situation that he remembers and says, whatever it is, I'll get the better of it. The President of the United States wasn't thrilled with you. I'll be thrilled with you because that's the way I operate. That's the way you're going to be in relationship to me. I'll always be thrilled because I'm more powerful or successful or I radiate more confidence than you. A lot of these things are part and parcel of everything I've lived with ever since with Donald Trump. And I go through this in some detail in the prologue in order to establish a couple of things. One, with Trump, most things are right out there. There are not a lot of deep hid schemes or evasions. And if you take the rhetoric seriously and you sort of look and stand back from it and say, what's he actually communicating, not only about the moment, but about himself, so you can learn a few things, which I wish I had. So I take myself to task for not looking at what was obvious and what was right in front of me. The other thing I do in the prologue is to say the psychological reaction the country has to Trump is something that's akin to his own psychology and how it sort of influences and infects our daily lives, because he's the most transparent president in terms of what he's thinking and when. I like to joke that every other president I've covered, there was always a component of the beat, and Paul Bedard was a White House correspondent when we were together at the Washington Times, he knows this. There was always a part of the beat of covering the president where you would ask yourself, and you'd kick it around the newsroom, what's the president thinking? I mean, what's the president really thinking? What's going on in his mind, and what's the strategic impulses, and what are the things he's weighing, or what's gotten under his skin? That was a part of the beat, hard to get to. You needed a lot of good sources, you needed to ask a lot of good questions. You could work weeks and weeks on a story that would sort of try to explain that for a given moment in the history of a presidency. That part of the beat is completely evaporated with Trump. We all know exactly what he's thinking, when he's thinking it, and how strongly he's thinking it. Because it's, again, all out there. And I should have been more aware of that, and I take myself to task for not understanding that, as a way of letting people know in this book, it's not just a know-it-all telling you what this know-it-all knows. I don't know it all. And the book doesn't attempt to ask and answer every possible question about the Trump presidency. It tries to capture what I think, by any fair standard, you can say, this happened, looks kind of important.
Over here, question.
Hello, first of all, congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
My name is Tomasz Grzywaczewski, and I am war journalist and writer from Poland. So another question from Europe, and of course, because I am from Central Europe, this is the question about Trump's attitude towards Russia, because I think the best way of describing like our situation and what people are thinking in Central Europe is, again, confusion.
Right.
It's really, so the question is, what's his attitude, or rather how to read the Trump, it's of course about reading your book,
right.
How to read him.
That's a tough one, because you have these inexplicable moments where Trump's own sense of pushing back from confrontation makes him look weak in Helsinki with Putin. One of the things I write about in the book is, for all the stuff that you saw in The Apprentice, you're fired and how aggressive he is, he actually interpersonally is not anywhere near that aggressive. He usually assigns other people to fire people. He doesn't fire people comfortably. He doesn't actually enjoy confrontation if it's an equal measure of confrontation. He'll scream and yell at people, and the phrase often used, rip your face off, when he doesn't actually think you're someone that matters to him in the moment. It's just part of if not an act, a demonstration of something that he's trying to get across, and maybe a mind he's trying to change. But in terms of actual confrontation, he's not very good at it at all. And that came vividly across in Helsinki. Given numerous opportunities, he just wouldn't do it. We don't know what happened in the private meeting with Putin. We know that his rhetoric in general has not been forgiving, but it hasn't been stinging either about Russia. And yet some of the actions that the administration has taken, again, take Trump out of it, just look at the actions. Listen to Prime Minister Theresa May and the reaction of the Skripal poisoning. We did more than any other country in terms of evicting Russians who were here, making a statement about that in terms of, yeah, lots of people who were here are now out. And we're closing these facilities down, and we're making a stand. Has he kept every sanction that Obama had? Yes. Has he repealed them? No. Has he sped up and then brought to fruition something that the Obama administration was constantly debating but never did, which is liquefied natural gas exports to Europe? They're now happening. Do they have the ports to take them all in? No, but they're working on it. Is that a counterweight? Yes. Is it the most significant one imaginable? No, but it is a counterweight about Russian influence of energy supplies to Europe. You look at those actions and you see, well, there's not a hesitancy on certain policy areas to confront Russia. And when he went to Poland and talked about the preservation of Western civilization as being the core component of the world's mission, he wasn't talking about preserving Russian civilization, he was talking about Western civilization. He meant Central Europe and everything around it. And so there is something that I think if Trump were sitting here, he would say, well, I like to confuse people. I like them not to know what my bottom line is. I always did that in business. My lawyers never knew what my bottom line was. My business associates never knew. My litigants who were suing me never knew what my bottom line was. My bankers didn't know what my bottom line was. Again, I'm not describing that as a patently effective approach to presidential leadership, but that aspect of Trump's persona flows through a lot of things. Now, on things he really cares about and feels he has a deep sense of knowledge, like the tax code, he can get fixated and tell you exactly what his bottom line is. 15% corporate tax rate. Why? Because it was super low, it was his number, and he loved it. You and I had a conversation about this when we were talking about the book. He just loved it. He said, 15, 15, 15. And he wasn't going to move. He said it all the time in every meeting, every speech. And then he moved. He moved to 21. What does that tell us? He gets fixated. He's insistent against all other odds and against all other conversations until the very end. When there's no other choice, Gary Cohn and Steve Mnuchin got him to 18, Paul Rand got him to 21. Not because they're wafflers on this issue, but because they understood the underlying politics, that if you're trading constantly from 15 to wherever you go, you can't stop it anywhere, and you're going to create more confusion and other things in the tax code that harm your other priorities. So there are times when he's deeply definitional and fixated in almost a childlike way, but it doesn't mean so much so that it obliterates his ability to compromise or move as long as he knows what the ultimate landing spot is. And oftentimes he'll land on that spot at the last minute and not even let anyone know that he's okay landing there. He keeps that ambiguity available to him, which creates confusion, unnerves those who are closest to him, because everyone who works close to a president always wants to say, I know exactly what the boss is thinking. Oh, you want the answer, you come to me. I'll tell you what the answer is, because that makes me more powerful in the West Wing. Almost no one in the White House can say that.
Question here.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Megan. I'm from the Cato Institute, and congrats on the new book.
Thank you.
So you've talked a lot this morning about all the different behaviors and precedents that Trump has had as opposed to presidents past in America's history. And I was just wondering, which ones of those new precedents and behaviors and trends that he's set do you think may be really beneficial for America in the long run, and which ones do you think maybe be really damaging or kind of bad changes?
It's a good question. And one of the things I point out in the book, it's part of our memory, but we don't think about it enough, in my estimation. So until Donald Trump was elected, no person, no man, obviously, had ever been elected president who hadn't done one of two things, measurable things, in their previous non-presidential life. Run for elective office and won, and served with a record that could be measured, or led large groups of armed people into a big-time battle and then succeeded. People who had run before, who had led large armies, but failed, and they didn't win. So we've elected, until Trump, people who had served in office, usually successfully, with some measurable record that could be looked at and appraised, or led people successfully into battle. Trump did neither. Trump disdained actually both. He went to a military academy, but he never served. And he had college deferments and then bone spurs. Not what we would typically associate with hardcore American individualist heroism. Disdained politics and politicians writing checks in every direction for the benefit of his business and his transactions. He treated politics as a purely transactional encounter. Okay, and yet we elected him. That tells us something as a country about what our expectations are for the American presidency and who is capable of filling that. I have a chapter in the book called Lottery Ticket, which is one of my metaphors for Trump himself. For his supporters, he was metaphorically a lottery ticket. What does that represent? Well, if you're no longer really confident in the economic system around you, you're willing to take some semi-educated or semi-rational chances outside of that. For many in our country, a lottery ticket is exactly that. You know the math, you know the odds are against you, but you're willing to take the chance. I think that metaphor works very well for a lot of Trump supporters I met. I'm not so sure, but I want to give it a try. I want to give it a go. Let's see what happens. He says he's going to knock things over. I want things knocked over. He's my lottery ticket. Okay. Is that a permanent part of the American psyche now for the presidency? I don't know. I don't know the permanence of Trump's approach to the job. I can fully see someone running for the nomination of either party making among their first promises, you know what, if you elect me, I won't tweet for the first year of my presidency. And people saying, I don't even care what your party is, I'm on board with that. Because I just don't want you in my head the way Trump is in my head. Maybe they do that, or maybe they say, you know what, not only am I going to tweet, I'm going to tweet every hour, and I'm going to have tweet press conferences, and I'm going to have Reddit town halls, and I'm just going to digitally invade your life 700 times more conspicuously than Trump. I don't know which direction it's going to go in. I just know we're going to be taking the measure of this moment and how many ways in which it's different. But I do think there is one aspect of the presidency that is a downside legacy of Trump's that I don't think any successor will toy with, which is his orientation to what the Justice Department is and what a approach of a president to that Justice Department is. Now, Trump would say if he were sitting here, look, Obama was as political with his Justice Department as any American president. He just never said anything about it. I say a lot of things, but I don't do anything. I pop off a lot, but I haven't really done anything. So don't talk to me about destruction of institutions. I just talk. I just pop off. I just express myself. And maybe the Justice Department pays attention to me, maybe it doesn't. But I haven't done anything. Obama was in there and he was political, and Eric Holder spared him from all sorts of things. Trump has this conversation in the White House all the time. Where's my Eric Holder? Where's my pit bull running the Justice Department, not necessarily to protect me, but to not turn against me? Again, that's his orientation to it, and because he's president, it's important. But I think that volatility around that subject is something any successor will shy away from.
One thing that I think will be permanent is putting together that list of potential Supreme Court justices. Could you do in the book, could you go through the history of that and your sense there?
So, it's an act of originalism, and opponents of Trump may not want to appreciate that, but I think they'd be wise to acknowledge it, and there are two different concepts there. You can acknowledge something without necessarily appreciating it, but you disable yourself if you don't even acknowledge something that was originally done by a political opponent of yours. And the list was something that Trump had an idea about, but he didn't know how to put it together. He didn't even know where to start. But at Jones Day, the law firm where Don McGahn was, who was the Trump campaign lawyer, they had a meeting with conservatives in early March of 2016. Trump was doing well, looking like he was heading toward the nomination, and a lot of various conservative players in town wanted to be there and meet him. Among them there was Leonard Leo, and they met after the lunch, after everyone left, Don McGahn, Trump, and Leonard Leo of Federalist Society. And I recount the conversation faithfully on the record in the book. And Trump says, I want a list. And Leonard says, why? He says, because people don't know me, and this will help them get to know me. This will help them get comfortable with me. That's an important insight. Trump knew what he didn't have, was looking for a way to fill in the gap of what he didn't have, and he thought a list about the Supreme Court would really help. He turned out to be absolutely correct about that. The list was important, not only in terms of him identifying this issue as important to him, but allowing people to take a measure of him on a serious subject, which he had dealt with at some degree of seriousness. There's a comical episode there about how many names Trump wants on the list. Leonard Leo did not come to this meeting completely uncertain of what was going to happen. He had 10 names in his pocket, but Trump wanted 12. Leonard says, I got 10. Trump says, I want 12. He's like, well, I got 10. Well, you better go back. So Leonard goes back and recounts it in the book, spends about 2 weeks, calls Don McGahn. He said, well, I got the list. Don says, well, who are the 12 names? He goes, I've got 11 names. Because he wants 12. Like, he's going to have to live with 11, okay? It is slightly comic, but again, it speaks to this idea of the fixation that Trump can sometimes have. He wanted 12. 12 was a good, solid, round number. 12. Not 11. 11 sounds, I don't know, it's not as good as 12. he didn't really know very much about the names. He wanted 12. 12 was important, but he settled on 11. But the list itself became kind of definitional in a certain kind of conversation about Trump. And then when he refined it and made it 21 in September of the general election campaign, he said, this is not just a notional list, this is the list. If I'm elected, my nominee will be chosen from this list. Importantly, Neil Gorsuch was on the second list, not on the first. Brett Kavanaugh wasn't on either. Brett Kavanaugh was on the third list, created after he was elected. So one of the things that's part of this current dialogue, and one of the things that I think doesn't disable, but is something that's not as strong with this nominee in terms of the political importance of these two lists, is that Kavanaugh wasn't on either of them. And if you're going to say, hey, I lay this before the country in terms of the general election, and this is what matters, and I'm vindicated by this, it would be helpful to have had Brett Kavanaugh's name on one of those two lists. He doesn't appear in either of them. But to Grover's point, ask yourself this question. Do you really think any person not named Donald Trump running for the Republican nomination in the future is not going to have a list about this topic? I don't think so. As a matter of fact, and when I was interviewing Grover for the book and we were kicking this idea around, Grover said, they'll go beyond the Supreme Court. They'll be like National Labor Relations Board. Here are my people, and they're going to have lists for all sorts of government agencies and regulatory bodies as a way of expressing seriousness and a way you can measure them and hold them accountable. But if you look at the exit polling data, this is the political component of the list, for a good number of Republicans, they ask themselves, I don't like Hillary, I'm not real comfortable with Trump, but who's going to be appointing future Supreme Court justices? Trump or Clinton? He gave me a list. I'm with Trump.
Could you compare the arc of, and you do this in your book, the successful drive for tax reform, tax reduction, and the aborted, unsuccessful drive for abolishing Obamacare?
Yeah. So I work out a couple things that have never really been explained about the failure to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. And it started very early in the transition, where Trump made a fateful decision, and not a politically unwise or unsophisticated decision. And I think it might very well have been influenced by Ivanka and Gary Cohn and others. But the decision he made was, I don't just want an early repeal vote. Whatever we do, replace has to be with repeal. So don't just give me a straight repeal vote, because I don't want to live in the political nether zone of something has been taken away and we don't know what's going to replace it. This was not the approach that Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell wanted. Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell wanted a repeal vote right early, even before Inauguration Day, if possible, right out of the gate. Hey, we repealed it. And then they wanted some unknown 6 months, 18 months, 24 months, 48 months, who knows, period to go around the country and listen and talk and absorb and craft the replacement legislation. Trump looked at that and said, that's a setup. Because I'm going to own repeal, but I'm not going to have replace, and I want both together. Well, that vastly complicated, that early decision made in the transition, and I recount Trump explaining that to Reince Priebus and Gary Cohn in a conference call early on, that forced Republicans to do something that they hadn't done, which is write a politically useful, meaning they could collect votes in both chambers, replacement bill. There was only one product that had ever gone through the House, that was the price bill. That wasn't considered politically viable in the Senate, and so this process of having to write something slowed everything down and created uncertainty and created a rapid sense that this was falling apart very soon. On healthcare, the president is simply not conversant. Most people are not about some of the intricate details of healthcare policy. It's heavyweight stuff. I have succeeded in almost 30 years in Washington not ever writing about healthcare policy at any level of detail, and that is not an accident, okay? It's heavy, dense stuff. And once you become an expert, then you're sort of an expert, you can't get out of that thicket. Trump never wanted to get into that thicket. And so his approach on lobbying members of Congress was of a certain kind. Can't we get a deal? Can't you just vote for it? Can't we just get a deal? Where are the votes? Can't we get it done? What's going on? Why can't we get a deal? Where's the deal? Where's the deal? Where's the deal? And in pursuit of the deal, he would frequently talk to members of Congress, and they would say, well, I need this. And Trump would say, okay, I'll get you that. Just make sure you vote yes. Well, he rapidly learned, and this frustrated those who were writing the legislation, that the president would call up and say, well, so-and-so wants this. All right, well, Mr. President, if we do that, then we're going to lose 5 over here. So the one you got us cost us 5. Well, I hate that. Where's the deal? Where's the deal? It would sort of redound back to that. The difference on tax cuts and tax reform is Trump had a much greater sense of the underlying issues. He dealt with many of them, not all of them, but a good deal of them. Knew his facts, knew his agenda, knew the specifics better, was more comfortable with them, liked talking about them more. But significantly, he learned from the process of healthcare. Whereas when he called lawmakers, House and Senate, and asked them what they needed, all he would say in that conversation was, I've taken notes, I'll hand this to the relevant chairman. They are writing the legislation, not me. Now, is that a massive change? No, but it's not an insignificant one. And gathering that information, giving it to the Kevin Brady in the House, Orrin Hatch and his staff in the Senate, made it a process that had more flow, more transparent internally, not externally, but internally, so everyone knew what the conversations were, and it produced a result. The other one didn't. Like I said, there are lots of different reasons. All of them, or most of them, are talked about in the book. But there is an arc of learning and an arc of difference in approach and a difference in result.
Last question. Sir? And then I would remind you that there are books to be purchased in the back. Major is willing to sign them with his own name and everything.
My own name and everything.
And everything. And there's coffee. That's usually extra. Coffee and donuts here as well. Sir?
Thank you, Major. Congratulations
Thank
on
you.
this book. I know that I'm going to learn an awful lot from it.
Hope so.
But I'd like you to take a longer view. Tom DeFrank with National Journal. Whether you love Trump or loathe Trump, it's hard, I think, for a reasonable person not to deny that he's been a polarizing president. I would argue that we've had 3 polarizing presidents in a row. 16 years of polarizing presidents in a row. So do you see a way that this polarizing reality that the country looks at now can be changed? And if so, what would be the action-forcing event, or what would be the scenario to get us out of this everything a pitch battle on everything?
Right. Well, you mentioned the long view. Let me take a real long view. In this sense, my wife is a PhD in political science. She's the director of the Graduate School of Political Management at George Washington University. She's working on a book now that compares the Gilded Age with what she terms the digital age. And one of the things that's interesting about these 2 periods of time is they brought with them tremendous technological change, and with that, enormous economic disruption, and a sense of either powerlessness or fear or anxiety about the changes happening in the economy with which Americans were living and having to adjust to on the fly. The other thing that's interesting about both periods of time is they had very close presidential elections, very hard drawn, very tight in terms of results, both popular vote and electoral, deeply contested, hard-edged elections, and many shifts in majority control of the Congress, both ages, in ways that we haven't seen replicated in other more comparatively, if not peaceable, but different times. Okay? So, after the Great Depression, politics moved in a kind of straight line Democratic direction for a very long time. But in both these ages, Republicans had it, then Democrats had it, back and forth. We've had shifts since 1994, back and forth. 1994, 2006, 2010, 2014. We may be on the cusp of another one right now. Who knows? The long view is it the presidents who are polarizing, or is it the anxiety of the times and the sense that neither party actually knows what to do about some of these massive changes. Because that's certainly the I think, fair assumption of the politics as they played out during the Gilded Age, when you had concentration of wealth, lots of massive, publicly well-known millionaires, which was the terminology then. You have that now, different industries, different people, but the same kinds of factors. You had a sense of, if not powerlessness, unease about the future of your economic destiny and the country's economic destiny. And politicians were very inept at explaining what these changes meant and how to adapt to them and what they could do to remedy this deep sense of anxiety. In the Gilded Age, I think it's fair to say we've had that experience now. The only president who sort of avoided that was Bill Clinton, in the sense that he appeared to, for his youth, be part of this new phenomenon. In the late 1990s, working with a Republican Congress, though that was not his inclination initially, he was forced to work with a Republican Congress because it wouldn't go away. It had an aggressive agenda. If you're curious about how all that played out, please read my third book, The Enduring Revolution, which is all about that. And technology stocks and technology companies were creating this water spout of growth, fed federal revenues, brought us surpluses for a while, unexpectedly so, and it seemed like this was positive and not disruptive. Then the disruption started to come in the early 2000s. Then 9/11 comes, and now we have terrorism and disruption, and uncertainty and anxiety. Seems to me it's worth at least asking ourselves, is the polarization a result of this psychological reaction to these economic disruptions and sense of fear about the specter of terrorism? Or is it the fault of political leaders who tell us something we should probably ask ourselves if it's even true? I can bring the whole country together. Oh, really? You by yourself can bring the whole country together. I mean, I think that's on its face a kind of ridiculous idea and concept, yet we seem to fall for it. And if you ask ourselves again, stepping back, have we become ever more reliant on this siren song of the outsider? The outsider who's going to fix all of the ills of Washington? Well, that trajectory just keeps moving in the more outsiderish direction, relentlessly so. George W. Bush did not campaign as an insider. Bill Clinton didn't campaign as an insider. Ronald Reagan didn't even campaign as an insider. He campaigned as an outsider within his own party and within the structure of American politics defined in that era. The only insider who's run and won is H.W. Bush. The only one. Then Barack Obama ran as an outsider. He ran as against John McCain, who also ran as an outsider. We have this addiction to outsiderism, okay? And we keep believing and telling ourselves, if we only just keep going higher and higher up this ladder of outsiderness, we'll figure it out. Well, we're about as far outside the outsiderist continuum as I think we can get. Again, Trump is completely different. Didn't leave people in the battle, didn't have elective office before. He's outside. And we're either going to say to ourselves, well, we just need one more outsider and that'll do it. Or we'll say, no, maybe outsider's not the answer. My big observation about this is that the times in which we live, we have a time which we can look back to, the Gilded Age, which has many of the same political markers in terms of result, antagonism, partisanship, and shifting political loyalties. I think there's something to be learned from that.
Major Garrett, thank you very much. Thank you for a great book. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. And we look forward to the next book.